What would you do if all you had left in the world was a single silver dollar and a grief too heavy to carry alone? What if the only thing for sale was a ghost, a mountain of rust half swallowed by a river that had already taken everything from you? For 18-year-old Cora Jessup, standing on the muddy banks of the Mississippi in the autumn of 1887, this wasn't a question. It was the last, desperate line of a story she felt was already over. She had just bought a derelict steamship for $1, a vessel the world had condemned as scrap. But the truth waiting inside its sealed heart, a truth guarded by 2 decades of silence and rust, would not just give her a future. It would reclaim a past she never knew she had lost. Settle in, and let us tell you a story about the things we throw away, and the quiet souls brave enough to find their value. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we journey back to a forgotten bend in the river. The air south of Memphis hung thick and damp, smelling of silt and decay. Cora stood beside the borrowed wagon, her hand resting on the warm, worn flank of the horse that had carried her away from the only life she'd known. Behind her lay the city, and in it, the gray stone walls of the orphanage that had been her home for the 6 months since her father's body was pulled from these same waters. He had been a riverman, born to it, and the river had claimed him as its own, leaving her with nothing but a hollowed-out feeling and a single, worn, silver dollar he'd pressed into her palm the last time she saw him. "For luck, Cora girl," he'd murmured, his voice rough as burlap. "Never be without a dollar in your pocket." Now it was the only thing in her pocket. Mr. Abernathy, the kindly clerk who had managed her father's meager final affairs, cleared his throat. He was a small man with a face full of worried lines, most of which seemed to be dedicated to her. He had been her father's friend, and in the vacuum of that loss, he had tried to be hers too. It was he who had told her of the government auction of derelict vessels, scrap metal to be cleared from the riverbanks. He saw the flicker of an idea in her eyes, an idea he'd tried to gently talk her out of. But Cora's quiet was a stubborn thing. He had driven her here himself, his own wagon loaded with a small canvas tent, a heavy wool blanket, a cast-iron skillet, and a box of hardtack and dried beans, a meager arsenal against the wilderness. "It's not too late, Cora," he said, his voice soft. "There are positions in the city, a seamstress, a laundress, honest work." She shook her head, her eyes fixed on the shoreline ahead. There, like the skeletons of great beasts, lay the rusted husks of a dozen steamships. They listed in the mud, their smokestacks tilted at weary angles, their paddle wheels broken and tangled in willow roots. They were monuments to failure, to storms and snags and the slow, grinding victory of the river. One of them was about to be hers. She turned to the old clerk, her gaze direct and clear. "He taught me the river, Mr. Abernathy. Said you have to respect it, but you can't ever fear it." She reached into her worn dress pocket, and her fingers closed around the cool metal of the dollar. It felt heavier than a coin. It felt like a promise. "Thank you for the ride, and for the supplies." He saw the finality in her face, and his shoulders slumped. He helped her unload the gear, his movements slow and sad. As the sun began to dip below the tree line on the far bank, casting the wrecks in long, distorted shadows, he climbed back onto his wagon. "I'll come check on you in a week's time," he called out. Not a question, but a statement. Cora just nodded, watching the wagon creak away until it was lost to the dusk, leaving her alone with the groaning of the metal and the whisper of the water. The auction the next morning was a grim, hurried affair held under a sky the color of dishwater. A handful of men stood around a fast-talking auctioneer, their faces hard with calculation. They were scrap dealers, mostly, men who saw the dead ships not as history, but as tonnage, their value measured in pennies per pound. And then there was Silas Croft. He was a landowner, a man whose wealth was new enough that he wore it like an ill-fitting suit, all arrogance and swagger. He owned much of the cleared land bordering this stretch of the river, and made it known he considered the wrecks an eyesore on his domain. The auctioneer rattled through the lots, his voice a flat monotone. Ships were sold for $10, $15, $20, their value stripped down to the raw material of their defeat. Finally, he pointed a dismissive thumb over his shoulder. Lot 12, the Morning Glory, side-wheeler, beached in the storm of '64. Hull compromised, engines seized, half filled with silt. We'll start the bidding at $1. A thick silence fell, broken only by the cawing of a crow. Croft let out a short, barking laugh. $1 for that pile of rust? I'll pay $1 to have it hauled away. The other men grinned. The auctioneer's eyes scanned the small crowd, impatient. $1? Do I hear $1? From the back of the group, a quiet voice spoke. $1. All heads turned. Cora stood with her chin held high, her hand raised almost imperceptibly. Croft stared at her, his lips curled in a sneer of disbelief. "Well, I'll be," he drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "What's a slip of a girl gonna do with a heap of rust?" The auctioneer, caring only for the completion of his list, didn't wait for another bid. "Sold!" he cried, banging a small wooden gavel against his palm. "For $1, to the girl." The bill of sale was a simple, grimy piece of paper. As Cora folded it and tucked it away, Croft approached her, his shadow falling over her. "You got spirit, I'll give you that," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But that boat's a coffin? Make a fine one for you, I suppose? Quicker than the river, at least." Cora met his gaze and said nothing. Her silence was a wall he couldn't seem to breach. He grunted and turned away, leaving her to her purchase. She walked toward it, her boots sinking into the soft mud. The Morning Glory was the largest of the wrecks, a once proud vessel now listing hard to port, its single remaining paddle wheel caught in a web of roots and vines. Up close, the scale of the ruin was overwhelming. Rust flaked off in sheets the size of dinner plates. The wood of the upper decks was blackened and splintered. The name, painted in faded gold letters on the prow, was barely legible, ghosted by time and weather. It seemed an impossible task, a fool's errand. This was her inheritance, a mountain of iron and sorrow. Why would an orphaned girl spend her last dollar on a sunken wreck? What secret could possibly be worth more than a life of security? We think we know, but the truth is always buried deeper than we imagine. Let us know in the comments what you think she'll find, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of impossible hope. Now, as the last light faded, Cora Jessup stood before her inheritance, and the river whispered its first welcome. The first days were a lesson in sheer survival. Cora set up her small canvas tent on a patch of high ground, 100 yards from the Morning Glory. She learned the landscape not as scenery, but as a larder and a threat. She found a clear, cold spring seeping from a rock face, gathered fallen branches for her fire, and used the snares her father had taught her to make to catch a pair of rabbits. With the few coins Mr. Abernathy had pressed on her, she walked the 2 miles to the nearest settlement, a dusty crossroads called Haven's Landing, to buy salt, flour, and a small sack of oats. It was there the whispers began. The townspeople watched her from the corners of their eyes. A girl, alone, living in a tent by the ship graveyard. They saw a fool or a lunatic. Children pointed, and their mothers pulled them away. The men at the general store took to calling her the Rust Queen, or more cruelly, Captain Cora. Silas Croft made a point of riding his fine black horse along the river path every other day, reining in just close enough for his laughter to carry across the water to her camp. He never spoke to her directly again, but his message was clear. He was waiting for her to fail. She ignored him, and she ignored the whispers. Her focus narrowed to the work. To get to the ship, she needed to haul supplies, and for that, she needed more than her own 2 hands. In Haven's Landing, tied behind the blacksmith's shop, was an old sway-backed mule with 1 floppy ear and a coat the color of dust. The smith wanted $5 for him. Cora had 2, which she'd earned by mending a fisherman's nets. She offered the $2 and a promise to muck out his stable for a month. The smith, a man with more pragmatism than sentiment, agreed. The mule was old and stubborn, but his eyes were patient. Cora named him Patience. He became her silent, steadfast companion, standing watch on the shore as she worked, his presence a quiet reassurance in the vast loneliness of the riverbank. One evening, as twilight bled purple and orange across the sky, a figure emerged from the dense woods that bordered the river. It was an old woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her hair in 2 long silver braids. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, carrying a basket woven from river cane. Cora had seen her before, foraging along the water's edge. The townspeople said she was Choctaw, one of the few who had remained, living as her people always had. The woman stopped near Cora's fire, her dark eyes moving from the girl to the hulking shadow of the morning glory. Cora tensed, but the woman's presence held no threat. After a long moment of silence, the woman spoke. Her voice low and raspy, like dry leaves skittering over stone. "Some things are not lost," she said, her gaze fixed on the rusted ship. "They only wait for the right hands to find them." Without another word, she turned and melted back into the growing darkness of the woods. Cora sat by her fire for a long time, the old woman's words echoing in her mind. She didn't understand what they meant, but they felt like a key, a piece of a puzzle she hadn't even known she was trying to solve. The weight of that cryptic sentence was a strange comfort, a small point of light in the vast, enveloping darkness. Cora knew she couldn't understand the ship from the shore. She had to get inside, to walk its decks and learn its bones. The physical journey began with a single, treacherous step. The gangplank had rotted away decades ago. She found a pair of long, sturdy logs and, with Patience's help, dragged them into the sucking mud, bracing them against the ship's listing hull to form a crude ramp to the main cargo deck. The deck itself was a death trap. Planks, softened to the consistency of wet bread, crumbled under her weight. Rusted metal snagged at her dress and boots. She spent a week doing nothing but clearing a path, prying up rotten boards and tossing them into the river, testing each step before putting her full weight down. She worked from dawn until her back ached and her hands were raw, clearing a safe walkway from her ramp to the main companionway that led to the upper decks and the cabins. Then the weather turned. A cold, steady rain began to fall. Not a storm, but a persistent, miserable drizzle that promised to last for days. It soaked her to the bone, turned the riverbank into a slick, greedy mire, and transformed the inside of her tent into a damp, chilly cave. The ship itself seemed to mourn in the rain. Rust-colored water wept from its seams, trickling down the hull in long, sorrowful streaks. The wind, funneled between the wrecks, moaned through broken windows and rotted doorways. The world shrank to the gray sky, the gray water, and the gray despair that began to seep into Cora's resolve. After days of waiting for a break in the weather that never came, she decided she could wait no longer. Wrapping herself in a piece of oiled canvas, she made her way across the slick logs and onto the deck. The door to the grand salon was swollen shut. She put her shoulder into it again and again until the wood splintered and the door groaned open. The sight inside almost broke her spirit. This had once been a place of splendor. Now it was a waterlogged tomb. Remnants of gilded molding hung in peeling strips from the ceiling. Velvet upholstery on the banquettes had dissolved into clumps of green and black mold. A grand piano stood against one wall, its veneer cracked and warped, its ivory keys swollen and silent, like a mouth frozen mid-scream. The ruin was absolute. It confirmed every jeering word from Silas Croft, every pitying glance from the townspeople. It was worthless. That night, huddled in her damp blanket, Cora felt the full weight of her decision. The rain drummed a relentless rhythm on the canvas of her tent. The morning glory groaned in the dark, the sound of a dying thing settling into its grave. She had traded her last dollar, her last connection to her father, for a pile of rot and rust. Despair, cold and heavy as riverstone, settled in her heart. She was a fool, an orphan and a fool, alone in the dark. She fell into a fitful sleep, haunted by dreams of her father's face, swirling in dark water. Sometime deep in the night, she was startled awake. The rain had lessened to a whisper, but another sound had taken its place. A faint, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't the wind, or the drip of water, or the creak of the hull. It was methodical. A quiet, insistent beat coming from somewhere deep within the iron heart of the ship. The sound was a mystery, and mystery was a stronger pull than despair. The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the world shrouded in a thick, wet fog. Cora lit her lantern, its small yellow flame a fragile defiance against the grayness, and went back aboard the Morning Glory. The tapping was still there, faint but steady. A knock, knock, knock that seemed to come from below her feet. She followed the sound, her lantern held high. It led her past the ruined salon, down a treacherous, slick companionway ladder into the lower decks. Here the air grew thick and close, heavy with the smell of stagnant water, oil, and 2 decades of decay. The sound grew stronger as she descended. It led her to the engine room. It was a cavern of machinery, a cathedral of iron. The 2 massive pistons, each as tall as a man, stood silent and frozen, coated in a deep orange crust of rust. The great boilers were cold and dark. The tapping seemed to be coming from the wall behind them, from the boiler room itself. But the way was blocked. The door to the boiler room wasn't just locked, it was sealed. A heavy iron plate, a half-inch thick, had been riveted over the entire doorframe, covering it completely. The edges were crudely welded to the bulkhead. This was the anomaly. This was the detail that didn't fit. In a shipwreck, you salvage. You pull out the brass fittings, the copper pipes, anything of value. You don't make a part of the ship more secure. You don't weld a tomb shut. Why would anyone go to such lengths to seal a simple boiler room? As she ran her hand over the cold, rough plate, her fingers traced a set of markings scratched into the metal near the edge. They weren't letters or numbers. They were symbols. A crude starburst next to a crescent moon. A personal sigil scrawled in haste. A memory surfaced. a fragment of a story her father had told her on a warm summer evening long ago, sitting on the porch of their small house. He'd spoken of the war, of the chaos on the river. He'd told her about how some of the Union patrol boats, carrying payrolls or sensitive dispatches, had a last-ditch safe, a captain's hold. It wasn't a separate room, but a small fireproof compartment built directly into the brickwork insulating the boilers, the most protected part of the ship. A place to hide something so valuable you'd sooner sink it than let it be captured. The Morning Glory had run aground in a storm, her father had said. It hadn't been attacked. It hadn't burned or exploded. There would have been time. Time to hide something. Time to seal the door. The seal itself was the clue. It wasn't an act of salvage. It was an act of deliberate, desperate concealment. Her despair from the night before evaporated, replaced by a new, burning curiosity. Whatever was in that room, someone had wanted it to stay there forever. She didn't have the tools to break that seal. Not yet. But as she stood there in the belly of the ship, her hand resting on the cold iron plate, she made a silent promise. She would find a way. The tapping had stopped, but she knew now what it was. The sound of a loose shutter or a piece of metal moved by the wind, knocking against the outer hull right next to the sealed room. It had been a coincidence, a ghost sound, but it had led her here. It had led her to the door. The mission now had a singular focus: breach the boiler room. The work of investigation became the work of pure, brute labor. Cora walked the 2 miles to Haven's Landing and went to the blacksmith's shop. Using the last of the money Mr. Abernathy had given her, she bought a 10-pound sledgehammer, a set of 3 cold chisels, and a long, heavy crowbar. The smith, a burly man with soot ingrained in the lines of his face, looked at the tools, then at her slender frame. "That's a lot of persuasion for a young lady," he grumbled, but he took her money without another word. The labor was the most punishing she had ever known. Each day she would descend into the ship's gut with her lantern and her tools. She started on the welds holding the iron plate. She'd place the tip of a chisel against a seam and swing the sledgehammer. The first blow sent a shock wave up her arms that rattled her teeth. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, a sharp, ringing crack that echoed through the hull. Patience the mule stood his faithful watch on the riverbank, his one good ear flicking in the direction of the ship with every clang, as if monitoring her progress. The sound became a new rhythm on the river, a declaration of war against the rust and the silence. Day after day, she worked. Her hands, soft from a life of mending and keeping house, blistered on the 2nd day. By the 4th, the blisters had broken, leaving raw, weeping skin. By the end of the week, the skin had begun to harden into calluses. Her shoulders burned, her back screamed, but she did not stop. She learned the metal, its points of weakness, the way it would groan just before a small piece flaked away. She was no longer just a girl. She was a smith, a salvager, a demolitions expert of one. Silas Croft rode by one afternoon, drawn by the incessant ringing. He reined in his horse at the water's edge and watched her, a small figure disappearing into the wreck. "Still at it, girl?" he shouted, his voice thick with amusement. "You'll break your back before you break that boat." Cora heard him, but she didn't pause. She simply repositioned her chisel and swung the hammer again. Clang. Her answer was the work itself. As she toiled, her mind worked over the clues. The ship went down in '64, a Union patrol boat. Her father had said it was caught in a sudden squall while hunting for Confederate raiders known to be operating in the area. sealed in a hurry. What was so important that a captain would choose to entomb it rather than risk it falling into enemy hands? Payroll for Union troops? Dispatches for a general downriver? She worked her way from the welds to the rivets, thick iron studs that held the plate fast to the bulkhead. The first one wouldn't budge. She worked on it for 2 full days, chipping away, finding the angle, learning the precise spot to strike. Then, with a high-pitched screech, it gave, popping loose and clattering to the floor. The small victory felt monumental. She knew how to do it now. Her hands, scarred and stained with rust, were learning the secret the iron held long before her mind could guess it. One rivet, then another. The work was slow, grueling, but it was progress. Near the end of the second week, she managed to drive her crowbar into the gap she'd created. With a final, desperate heave, the top corner of the iron plate began to bend outward, revealing a sliver of profound, silent darkness behind it. With the first breach made, a renewed energy surged through her. She worked the crowbar into the gap, using a broken piece of a piston rod as a fulcrum. She put her entire weight into it, her muscles screaming in protest. There was a low, wrenching groan of tortured metal, a sound that vibrated through the entire hull, and then the plate, with a final, shuddering sigh, tore free from the remaining rivets and crashed to the iron floor with a deafening boom. Dust and rust filled the air. When it settled, the original boiler room door was revealed. Its hinges were fused, its lock a solid block of corrosion. There would be no picking this lock. She turned to her crowbar again, jamming the tip into the seam between the door and the frame. For hours, she worked at it, heaving and resting, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Suddenly, the rusted lock mechanism shattered internally. The door swung inward with a piercing shriek, opening into a blackness so complete it seemed to swallow the light from her lantern. She took a steadying breath and stepped across the threshold. The air inside was still and surprisingly dry, tasting of cold iron and dust. The 2 great boilers stood like silent iron tombs. And there, against the far wall, built into the heavy brickwork that surrounded the firebox, was another door. Small, square, and made of thick cast iron. A safe. This was it. The captain's hold. The lock on this door was a brass combination dial, its face green with verdigris, its tumblers frozen by time. She wasted no time trying to turn it. Instead, she took up her hammer and a sharp chisel and went to work on the hinges. This was finer work, requiring precision. Blow by blow, she chipped away at the hinge pins. It took the rest of the day and into the night. Finally, with a sharp crack, the last hinge gave way. The heavy iron door fell forward onto the floor. Holding her lantern high, she peered into the small, dark compartment. It was not filled with treasure, not in the way stories would have it. It was a simple, dry space, barely 2 feet square. On a single clean shelf sat 3 items: a cylindrical tin document tube sealed with wax, a heavy leather courier pouch stamped with the seal of the U.S. Army, and a small, heavy iron lockbox. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She reached for the lockbox first. It was heavy, far heavier than its size suggested. The lock was simple, and she broke it easily with the tip of her crowbar. She lifted the lid. Her lantern light glinted on gold. Stacks of coins, neatly wrapped in oilcloth. U.S. gold eagles minted in the 1850s. There must have been 200 of them. A fortune. Enough to leave this riverbank, to start a life anywhere she chose. Her hands shaking, she set the box aside and picked up the tin tube. She broke the brittle wax seal and slid out a roll of papers. They were cotton futures contracts, dozens of them, dated 1863, for thousands of bales from plantations up and down the river. If the claims were still valid, they were worth even more than the gold. Lastly, she reached for the leather pouch. It felt stiff and ancient. The wax seal, bearing the eagle insignia of the army, was cracked but unbroken. It was addressed to the military governor, Western Tennessee District, Memphis. With a deep breath, she broke the seal and tipped the contents into her hand. There were several pages of official-looking dispatches. But one document on top was different. It was written on heavy parchment, its script formal and precise. She read the words, her lips moving silently. A full and unconditional pardon. For a man named Alistair Finch, convicted of treason against the United States, signed by the military governor, dated May 4th, 1864. She read the name again, the letters seeming to burn in the lantern light. Alistair Finch. That was her mother's maiden name. It was the name of the grandfather she had never met. The lantern flame trembled in her unsteady hand. Alistair Finch, her grandfather, hanged as a Confederate traitor in the summer of '64. That was the great, unspoken shame of her mother's family, a shadow that had followed them even after her mother married and took the Jessup name. Her father had spoken of it only once, in hushed, pained tones, calling it a sorrow that had broken her mother's parents and led to the loss of everything they had. Their family home, a sprawling plot of land upriver known as Jessup's Landing, had been confiscated by the Union Army as the property of a traitor. This piece of paper, this pardon, would have saved him. It would have saved all of them. It had been right here, sealed in the dark, while her grandfather walked to the gallows. The weight of it was suffocating. As she sat there on the cold iron floor, lost in a history she had just unearthed, a low rumble vibrated through the hull of the ship. The air, which had been still, began to move, a low moan winding through the wreck. She scrambled out of the boiler room and up the ladders. When she emerged onto the deck, the sky to the west was a bruised, churning wall of black. A Mississippi storm, a true monster, was bearing down on them, the wind preceding it already tearing at the water, whipping it into a frenzy. The river was rising, climbing the muddy banks with an unnatural speed. This was her test. She had the gold. She had the contracts. She could fill her pockets, abandon the ship and its ghosts, and disappear. She could buy a new life, far away from the river that had taken her father and the shame that had haunted her family. But the pardon was different. It wasn't about money. It was about a name. It was about justice, 20 years too late. It was about her father, who had lived his life under the weight of a dishonor that was never his. As she stood paralyzed by the choice, a shout, thin and desperate, cut through the howl of the wind. Out on the swollen, churning river, a small flatboat was in trouble. The family aboard, a man, a woman, and 2 small children huddled together, had lost power and were being swept sideways toward a massive snag of fallen trees and debris that would tear their small craft to pieces. In that instant, the choice was gone, replaced by pure, unthinking instinct. She grabbed the coils of heavy rope she'd been using to haul supplies. Securing one end to the main capstan on the Morning Glory's foredeck, she worked her way to the edge of the listing hull, the wind and rain tearing at her. She yelled to the man on the boat, her voice raw. She threw the rope once, twice, the wind snatching it away. On the 3rd try, he caught it. With the rope secured to his boat, the fight began. Cora wrapped the line around the capstan, using its leverage, her feet braced against the deck. The current was a monstrous, living thing, pulling the flatboat toward the snag. But the Morning Glory, her dead weight half buried in the earth, became an anchor. Slowly, foot by agonizing foot, Cora hauled them in, the man on the boat pulling with her. Finally, the flatboat bumped hard against the steamship's iron hull. She helped the terrified family, a farmer named Thomas, his wife Sarah, and their two wide-eyed children, scramble aboard her wreck. She led them to the captain's quarters, which she had recently cleared of debris. It was dry and sheltered from the worst of the wind. She built a small fire in the rusted stove, shared her meager supplies of food, and gave them her own wool blanket. She chose to shelter these strangers, to commit to the place she now stood. All night, the storm raged. The river rose, slamming against the Morning Glory, making the old ship groan and shudder as if it might be torn from its muddy grave. But it held. The wreck that everyone had called a coffin became an ark. By morning, the storm had broken. A weak, watery sunlight filtered through the clouds, illuminating a world transformed. The river was a brown, churning torrent, littered with debris, but it had begun to recede. The family was safe. The father, Thomas, was a plain-spoken farmer whose land was a few miles upriver. He looked at Cora, his face etched with a gratitude so profound it needed few words. "You saved us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My children, you saved them." As they waited for the water to calm, Cora, moved by the night's events, found herself telling him her story. She showed him the pardon. Thomas, a man who understood the value of land and a good name better than anyone, was stunned into silence. He looked from the pardon to the rusted hull of the ship around them. "This isn't a wreck, miss," he said finally, his voice full of awe. "It's a vault." He vowed then and there to help her in any way he could. When Thomas and his family were able to safely return to their farm, the story of their rescue traveled with them. It moved through Haven's Landing not as a whisper, but as a tale told with reverence. The girl on the riverbank, the fool, had saved the Miller family. The mockery that had followed Cora like a shadow evaporated. The whispers changed. The Rust Queen was forgotten, replaced by the girl on the Glory. She was no longer an outcast. She was a fixture, a part of the river's story. A few weeks later, accompanied by Thomas for protection, Cora journeyed to Memphis. She carried the leather pouch, the tin of contracts, and a small, heavy sack of gold coins. She went straight to the office of Mr. Abernathy. The old clerk's jaw dropped as she laid the contents of the captain's hold on his desk. He stared at the pardon, his eyes welling with tears. "Your father," he whispered. "If he had known." He sprang into action, his worry replaced by a fierce, protective energy. He led her to the law offices of a Mr. Davies, a quiet, serious man known for his integrity, the kind professional who could navigate the labyrinth of post-war property claims. Mr. Davies examined the documents with meticulous care. He spent a day consulting military archives and land registry records. The next afternoon, he called her back to his office. His face was calm, but his eyes held a deep respect. "The pardon is authentic, Miss Jessup," he stated. "It was issued, but the courier's vessel, the Morning Glory, was reported lost in a storm. The pouch was presumed sunk with all hands." He paused, then slid another document across the desk. "This is the order of confiscation for the property of Alistair Finch. The pardon, being dated prior to the execution, retroactively nullifies the conviction, which means this order is void." He let the words sink in. The land, all 200 acres of Jessup's Landing, is, and legally has always been, yours. He went on to explain that the cotton futures, tied to that same land, were also valid, a staggering windfall. The news rippled through the county land office. One afternoon, as Cora was leaving the Memphis courthouse, she saw Silas Croft on the street. He was on his way to see his own lawyer, no doubt having heard that his attempts to acquire the abandoned Jessup property had been blocked. Their eyes met across the dusty street. For a moment she expected a sneer, a final contemptuous dismissal. Instead, he stopped. He slowly raised a hand to his hat and tipped it in a gesture of silent, unambiguous defeat. Then he turned and walked away. The town that had laughed at her now saw her for what she was, not a fool who had bought a wreck, but the keeper of a history they had all chosen to forget. A year passed, the seasons turned, and the river rose and fell with its ancient rhythm. It was spring again, and the air was soft with the smell of damp earth and new leaves. The morning glory was still beached on its muddy throne, but it was no longer a skeleton. Cora had used a small portion of the gold not to raise the ship, but to save it. A local crew, managed by Thomas, had stabilized the hull with heavy timbers, replaced the rotted decks with new planking, and patched the leaking roof of the upper cabins. The entire vessel had been scraped clean of the worst rust and given a fresh coat of white paint, its name repainted in proud black letters. It was no longer a wreck. It was a landmark. It was her home. The Grand Salon, cleared of its mold and ruin, was now a bright, airy living space, its windows looking out over the water. The farmer Thomas and his family, now her closest friends, had a small, thriving farm just a mile away, and his children often came to play on the wide, safe decks of the ship they called the Big White Boat. One evening at golden hour, Mr. Abernathy came to visit from Memphis. He and Cora stood together on the upper deck, leaning against the rail, looking out at the river. The setting sun cast a warm, amber light over everything. Across the water, on the land that was now hers, columns of smoke rose from clearing fires. Jessup's Landing was being prepared for its first planting in over 20 years. The lawyers settled the last of the cotton contracts. Mr. Abernathy said quietly, "You're a wealthy woman, Cora. Wealthier than Silas Croft, I'd wager. You could build a mansion here. You could go anywhere in the world." Cora didn't take her eyes off the land. She thought of the gold still locked away, the piles of paper that translated to immense fortune. They felt distant, like someone else's story. Her gaze drifted from the land back to the solid deck beneath her feet, to the gentle rock and sway of the great, wounded ship that had become a part of her. She had come here with nothing but $1 and a name she thought was worthless. She had found a fortune, but the money felt like the least of it. It was a tool, nothing more. Mr. Abernathy watched her, his old, kind face full of affection. "What will you do now?" he asked. Cora drew a deep breath of the river air, fragrant with cottonwood and willow. She finally turned her eyes from the horizon and looked at the aging ship around her, at its sturdy rails and painted smokestacks. "The gold just bought the tools," she said, her voice quiet but clear as a bell. "The pardon bought back my name." She paused, a small, serene smile touching her lips as she looked back at her friend. "But I think all I ever really bought for that $1 was a place to stand." Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet courage. It reminds us that true inheritance isn't what we are given, but what we choose to reclaim. If you were moved by Cora's journey, please leave a like and a comment below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories from the forgotten corners of history. We'll see you next time, when a simple locket found in a dusty attic unravels a secret that will change a town forever.